Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by mytravelcreditcard.com. Check out mytravelcreditcard.com for some travel credit cards that we have chosen just for you. One card, for instance, that we're featuring right now will get you 60,000 reward points. Will get you into hundreds of airport lounges for free. Will also save you $200 with Uber credits and up to $200 in airline fees as well. For your travel credit card needs, go to mytravelcreditcard.com.
I got my bags packed on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no. 15
Amateur Traveler, episode 679. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about a 457-mile journey over unpaved roads from Dawson City, Yukon, to the shores of the Arctic Ocean as we ride the Dempster Highway. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about this road in northern Canada. I'd like to welcome to the show Lisa from thehotflashpacker.com, who has come to talk to us about the Dempster Highway. Lisa, welcome to the show. And where is the Dempster Highway? Let's put it on the map here first.
So in Canada, it starts in Yukon, a little ways away from Dawson City, and it goes north almost 550 miles up through Yukon and then Northwest Territories. And the road eventually ends in a town called Tuktoyaktuk, Northwest Territories, which is right on the Arctic Ocean, the Beaufort Sea.
And I'm going to guess from the name of Tuktoyaktuk
Yes.
that it is a predominantly indigenous people city.
That's correct.
Okay. just a wild stab in the dark there. Okay. Excellent. And why should someone drive? We're talking about a road trip in this particular case, the Dempster Highway.
Yeah. You actually can fly up to Tuktoyaktuk and Inuvik, which is about 90 miles south of Tuktoyaktuk, but the whole fun was getting there on the drive. So the drive is quite scenic. There's some wildlife, not a ton of wildlife. We can maybe talk about that a little more later.
Mm-hmm.
Then, yes, there's a few cities. Literally, I think there were only 3 cities. And by cities, I mean towns along this 550-mile road. You are in the remotest of remote. I did not see cars sometimes for an hour. Sometimes then I'd see 5 in a row, but it's just a way you can get away from the crowds of tourism, see some really beautiful sights, and get some culture as well with the villages in the north.
And I'm going to take a wild stab here that you did this in the summertime.
Yes.
Okay. Rather than this being an episode of Ice Road Truckers or something.
So interesting enough, that last 90 miles was just completed in 2017.
Just paved or just...
Oh, no, this entire road I'm talking about, this is 550 miles of gravel road.
Oh my gosh.
Each way.
Okay.
Each way. But the last 90 actually wasn't completed until 2017. Up until 2017, that last 90 miles between, it's called Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk, was only a winter road on the ice road, and that ice road
Huh.
went along the Mackenzie River and then into the Arctic Ocean and around the bend and into Tuktoyaktuk. But in 2017, they made it a 12-month road, so it could be open year round. Because prior to that, you really could only fly between those two places.
And was that because they're opening it up to oil exploration or something like that? There was
Yeah, that's the guess. Okay. Correct.
Okay. So, first of all, why did you decide to do this?
So I was driving to Alaska. That was my plan for the summer.
And you got lost.
No, not quite. So I live in the Seattle area, and I kind of always bucket list Alaska.
Mm-hmm. Alaska by land, Alaska up the...
by land, yeah.
Okay. Up
So
the Alaska
I actually
Highway.
bought a van. It's been a little over a year and a half ago. And I've kind of been taking trips of increasing distance away from here. So my first trip, I drove to the Midwest. Then another one, I drove to California. And then this time I was like, well, I'm going to drive to Alaska. And I tried to get as much time off work as I could. So we had agreed I was taking 2 months off. And so I started to think, well, what is going to be my route? I had seen there were two, like I love paper maps. So I always like to grab a paper map and see, well, where can I go? And I saw these two roads that went up to the Arctic Ocean. And I said, that would be cool to go to the Arctic Ocean. I've actually never been past the Arctic Circle before. And both of these roads went over the Arctic Circle. I'd actually only been a few miles from the Arctic Circle before in Iceland, but I didn't cross it. So I looked into them more. I researched them. The other highway is called the Dalton Highway, and that's the one that is in Alaska that goes to Prudhoe Bay. And I kind of weighed the pros and cons of what I thought these two trips would be, and I decided to do the Dempster.
Okay.
That being said, I did it a little off schedule. I was planning to go up in July for a festival, but it was really, really smoky this summer. So I got up to Whitehorse. It was about July 10th or so, and it was just smoke over. And so
that's
I
a shame.
just completely changed my plans, and I kind of went south and did like southern Alaska first, and really avoided the smoke, and it was beautiful by the time I did my trip around August 10th up the Dempster.
Okay, so not quite as long days as you had in July when I know I was there for the 4th of July. It was like the third day that I stayed up late enough to actually see the sun go down. It was
it
long
still
days.
didn't get completely dark at night, but it was the sun obviously does set in August.
Okay, so now with the Dempster Highway, are there any options? Is there just one road, one route?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Great. Well, tell us more. You're driving up the Dempster Highway. Where should we stop, and what should we do along the way?
So I'm kind of going to go from south to north in this description. So the first major place you're going to get is actually probably the most scenic area of the whole thing. It's, I don't know how many miles in, maybe 80 or 100 miles in, and it's called Tombstone Territorial Park.
Okay.
This is in Yukon. Some super beautiful mountains and lakes, and there was already fall color in early August when I was there.
Sure.
Yeah, August 10th, you've got fall colors already when you're that far north. But yeah, just gorgeous, amazing. I've been looking on Reddit in the section, it's called Earth Porn. It's like beautiful pictures, and there's been a lot of pictures from that recently. So not for me, someone else.
And you say the road started from Dawson City.
It's maybe, I don't know, 15 miles from Dawson City is where you actually get onto the Dempster Highway. And then you're turning off the Klondike Highway onto the Dempster, and it's gravel from mile zero. There's a gas station, a card lock gas station right at the corner, and then it's gravel. You cross a bridge and you're on it. So that Tombstone is amazing, and a lot of people spend a day or two there. There's some really great hikes in that park.
Do you have a favorite of the hikes in that park?
I didn't get to do it. It was kind of like the weather was a little off, but I had the name of it. Oh, I think it's like Golden Sides. That's like the kind of, if you have a couple hours to do a hike, I think it's something like Golden Sides.
Okay. And then did you want to say anything about Dawson before we go further north?
Dawson is Kind of a fun town. I happened to be there. I actually spent my time in Dawson after I did the Dempster because there was a city festival going on called
Hmm.
Discovery Days. It's one of the holidays in Yukon. So lots of fun stuff going on. But if you're going to Dawson, you have to do Diamond Tooth Gerties. It's the can dancers
Yeah,
and
yeah.
casino. And one of the nights I was there was a guy with a great big beard sitting next to me, and I said, "Let me guess, you're a gold prospector?" And he's like, "Yes." And he went on to tell me the story of his life. He's 73 years old, and he's telling me about his four marriages and how he struck it rich multiple times in his life only to lose it. It was quite a story. You never know who you're going to meet in Diamond Tooth Gerties in Dawson City.
Well, and I have to ask, did you touch the toe?
I did not do the sourdough. No.
You want to explain to our listeners what we're talking about?
Yeah, there's a bar where you can do a shot where it literally has, I think, a dead person's toe in the liquor.
It's a detached toe. I understand that some of the toes now have been donated by people who are still alive, but yeah.
Yeah, I did not. I chose not to do that.
I know people who've done that, and they say it's tradition and it's mandatory, and I'm thinking like you, no thanks. I don't need to do that.
No.
But yeah, now actually people
No.
do donate their toes, but originally it was. There's a story behind why they ended up with this cocktail in it. I think it does go back to the Yukon Gold Rush days, or at least that's the story that they tell you there. But yeah, somebody did swallow the toe, so now there's a penalty if you do swallow the toe. I understand.
Yep.
I can't imagine.
Well, I can imagine because I saw a lot of drunk people in Dawson.
That could very well be, and I think that is a lot of the tradition in Dawson City back when this was the Yukon Gold Rush. It was a little bit of a wild town at that time.
Yeah.
Excellent. So you had us up at Tombstone Territorial Park, and we're heading north from there.
So from there, you're heading north. There is not a lot for the next big section. There's scenic points. There's a viewpoint of I think it's like Olgavy, Peel Rivers. And then you get to Eagle Plains, which is the first gas station. And that is something like 200 it's almost half of the way.
Okay.
Up there.
Well, we should talk about what kind of terrain you're driving through here. We mentioned the gravel road here, but you mentioned plains. But this first part here, you are not in plains.
Yeah. So the first part is kind of mountainous, but you're kind of going up and over a couple like lower passes through the tombstones,
which look fairly jagged and new.
Then there's a lot of kind of rolling hills and then a little bit of plains. Mm-hmm. You really get to plains once you start getting up to like the Mackenzie River. So, okay, let me go north a little bit further now. So there's another place in Yukon, which is the crossing of the Arctic Circle. So there's actually a signpost there at the Arctic Circle and a very nice view from that spot. A lot of people actually just drive up to that and then go back. They don't go all the way to the end.
Okay.
I actually, probably half of the people I met at Eagle Plains when I just be chit-chatting with people at the viewpoints and this and that, they said they were just going to the Arctic Circle.
Well, and are you driving above the tree line already by that point?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of trees by the Arctic Circle.
Okay.
There are some, but not a lot.
Because I know down by Whitehorse you still have trees. I haven't been to Dawson. When are you feeling like you're really in the Arctic and the tundra?
Yeah, okay. So, then north of the Arctic Circle, you go there's the border at Yukon and Northwest Territories. That's probably the highest pass on the whole trip. In fact, there was snow there on August 10th, or I guess it would have been about the 11th when I crossed there.
Yeah.
That's one of the higher passes. And then you're going down to these rivers. So there are two rivers. Neither of them have a bridge. They actually are ferries. By ferry, you cross these two rivers. Now you're in the Northwest Territories, and that is pretty flat. So it's a lot flatter from this point, from these rivers to the end.
And you say these two rivers, I'm seeing the Peel and the Mackenzie. Am I in the right ballpark?
Yes, the Peel and the Mackenzie.
Okay.
There's a lot of trees still in this spot. So you're really not kind of north of the tree line until you get north of Inuvik, which that's about the last 90 miles.
Oh, interesting.
And
Okay.
mostly grassland. There were actually quite a few berries up there in August that were ripe called cloudberries. Yeah, it's a lot of scrub up that last 90 miles or so.
Well, once you get to this area, it's very wet from what I'm seeing. Is there a time to avoid? Is there a black fly season or a time when the mosquitoes are not as bad? Or
I totally lucked out this summer
okay.
with mosquitoes and everything. So I did not encounter, this is pretty crazy. I mean, 2 months going to Alaska, it was only buggy like around July 4th week.
Okay.
The rest of July and August was relatively bug free. So I did not have them, but they had a very dry June. And that's why there were fires in July and August.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So something about that dry June meant there were not bugs. But I understand bugs can be very bad. I've seen some YouTube videos of people that have gone up the Dalton, for example, and the mosquitoes look like hummingbirds. They're so big and so many. Yeah, I lucked out. But I think if you have a wetter summer, you could definitely get insects up there.
Well, and I know some people talk about when you're heading up to this area, if you head later in the season after the first frost, then things calm down quite a lot in terms of what kind of things you're going to run into there. Of course, then you're starting to run into problems with, well, what if the first frost and the first snow happen at the same time?
Yeah. So like I said, I had a little bit of snow that day of the 11th. I also had a little bit of snow that day I did the drive to Tuktoyaktuk.
Oh, so let me clarify. When you said you had snow, I was thinking you meant there was snow on the ground. You're saying it was snowing.
One day there was snow on the ground. The other time it was just snowing and melting. But
okay.
I'm not used to snow. And in fact, just a week after this, I was heading back south to come home, and they had a really heavy snowstorm August 18th in northern British Columbia that shut down the road. It was a strange summer, I think, for weather up there.
Yeah, we're seeing a few of those these days. So you crossed the rivers, you say, on single car ferries?
Not single car ferries. They fit, I don't know, you could probably get 10 vehicles on those.
Got it.
So the longest wait I had was maybe half an hour.
So they just run constantly, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So they synchronize them so that if you're coming south from Inuvik, you can get on the first one at 8 and the second one at 9 and go south.
Okay.
So they close down overnight from about midnight to 8, roughly, each of them. But they're synchronized about an hour different.
Okay. And then your next stop is Inuvik?
Yep, Inuvik. I spent 2 nights there with the day in between actually day tripping up to Tuktoyaktuk. It's possible to overnight up there, but I just chose to do that in a day trip. It's only 90 miles each way, but it takes almost 3 hours driving each way. It had rained that morning and the roads were just like slop. That's the one thing I'll warn you about the Dempster. And somebody told me before I started the Dempster, they said, if it rains and it's sloppy, just pull over to the side of the road and you've got a van, you can camp there, just sleep and wait till the road dries out. And I kind of took that to heart. And the one day I did decide, I'm not going to drive for a while until it dries out, I heard both a bus and an RV had gone into the ditch that day. So that road can get very sloppy and you'll be in about 4 inches of mud if it's rained.
Oh my gosh.
All night long.
So when you say wait for it to dry out, how long are you waiting for it to dry out?
Well, now we're kind of talking about my trip back. But the day I was going to leave, it had rained all night. And I pulled out to the main highway and I could see it was just slop. So I just decided to stay put in Inuvik, and I thought, I might just spend even another whole night. But it stopped raining in the morning, and it was pretty dry all day, and I kind of hung out. I went to the various visitor centers around town. They actually had a free art class, so I ate a little dream catcher at the Western Arctic Visitor Center, and so by 5:30, it looked pretty dry, so I'm just like, I'm going to drive for 6 hours, and I drove until I kind of got tired, and I just pulled over and camped. So, yeah, if it's dry, you drive. If it's wet, it's worth just finding something to do instead.
Okay, well, and you mentioned things to do, and you mentioned the art class at the
The Western Arctic Visitor
With
Center.
the Western Arctic Visitor Center, is that something that you would recommend, the Western Arctic Visitor Center, or are there other things you would recommend we do while we're in town?
One thing that is sort of the most famous and iconic place in town is the Igloo Church.
Okay.
It's a dome church, and they've painted it kind of to look like an igloo. It's white and blue, sort of shaped like an igloo. It's a Catholic church.
Okay. Our Lady of Victory Church?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. They do tours of I think almost every other day or so in the evenings. So one thing I'll say is they're really good about advertising their activities around Inuvik. So you go to the campground, there's a bulletin board, and you go in the library and there's a bulletin board. The things are not open all the time, but when they are open, there's advertisements to say, hey, on this day you can tour the greenhouse, and on this day you can tour the church. So they kind of do it later in the day. So it's usually at 5 p.m., 6 p.m. that some of these things are open and you're able to do these.
Okay. And you mentioned the greenhouse.
Yeah. So I also attempted to do a tour of the greenhouse. It turned out I showed up at 5:30 and they said, oh, we're not having a tour today. But I said, hey, can I have a look inside anyway? So I did get to visit the greenhouse, which is part of the university up there. It's pretty cool to see all these. It's basically like pea patches. So people have their own little patch.
Well,
and
if you're picturing the little tiny greenhouse in somebody's backyard, that's not what we've got here, right?
No, it's not humongous, but there's maybe 100 little pea patches in that building, or maybe less than that, 50.
Well, from what I'm reading, it's a converted ice hockey rink. So think size of an ice hockey rink.
Yeah.
And other things you did in town that you would recommend?
If you need internet, they have good internet at the library. I did not have data on my whole trip. And you're so remote in some of these places, you're not going to have any cell phone coverage. Probably if you had the right plan, you'd have cell phone coverage in Inuvik. But yeah, plan on not having cell phone coverage up there.
And then you say you did a day trip up to the end of the road.
Yes. Yeah.
And notice how I cleverly avoided trying to say the name of the city, the town again.
Yeah.
Took.
I had to practice it a bunch of times. In fact, I was, how when something happens and you say 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, I always was like, I knew when these trucks came by, sometimes there was gravel thrown up at you.
Oh,
so
sure. Yeah.
1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, I did 1 tuk, 2 tuk. Yeah, so tuk is mostly there's not much on the trees between those two towns. That was kind of the worst of the roads that I drove because it took 3 hours to go 90 miles. In Tuktoyaktuk, they have a small visitor center. They have a couple shops. One was open, one was not. They have a sod
You mean
house.
literally a couple shops. Okay.
Yeah, well, there's a gas station and some shops for locals, the northern store that has all the things where they would get groceries and clothes and this sort of stuff. But there was a souvenir shop and there was like a shop that sold arts and crafts, but it wasn't open.
And do they get enough visitors that when you walk into the souvenir shop, they're not surprised to see you?
Yes, there were actually a couple other people in there when I walked into the souvenir shop.
Okay.
Yeah. And there were a couple people in the visitor center when I was in the visitor center. But I would say they maybe get, when I was there, 100 visitors a day. And I suspect more if you were going in, like, say, July. But this is kind of becoming a popular place to visit, especially Germans. I met quite a few people from Germany on this trip. I think they have a fascination with Yukon. But getting back to Tuktoyaktuk, the most famous place is sort of the Spit. So there's this peninsula that goes out to the Arctic Ocean. So you can actually camp there now. It's like $63 a night to camp as of the summer. That has changed over time. It used to be free to camp out there about a year ago, but once they started getting so many visitors, they obviously want to pay for the porta potties and everything else out there. So you can camp there, but in the daytime, it's free to go out park. There's a famous sign. There's a big blue and reflective sign that says Arctic Ocean. So you can get your pictures taken by the Arctic Ocean sign. I drove my really muddy van right next to it and got pictures of that. But the other famous thing to do in Tuktoyaktuk is to go to the restaurant. It's Grandma's Kitchen, and they do things like burgers and bison burgers and things like that. But you can actually try some delicacies that are local to the area. So it's mukluk, which is beluga. And they had raw beluga, and they had like a jerky, like a beluga jerky. And then they also had the more famous thing they have there is dried fish. So it's just a white fish out of the ocean, and they dry and smoke it. And sometimes there is a place out at that peninsula where you can also buy dried fish, but it wasn't open the day I was there. It was pretty blistery the morning I arrived there. So I think it was maybe deader than if it were a really nice weather day where everybody would be out and about.
Okay. Well, I was just looking at the weather. I was just curious to see, and I see the record high for August is about 81 degrees, 27 in Celsius. The record low, 27 degrees, so just a little below freezing, which beats December where the record low is minus 58 degrees.
Yeah.
And the total record wind chill, I think, is minus 70 degrees one time, but even the average lows are well below freezing in the wintertime, so...
Yeah, and there was a little bit of like sleet and snow the morning I arrived there, so it was pretty close to freezing the day I was there.
Okay. Well, and my understanding is that the Arctic actually freezes here too, so this is not a port in that sense, at least not year round.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So keep in mind, in the winter, they used to have the ice road there. So it
Right.
wasn't solid enough to be able to drive semi-trucks on it.
So you drove this whole way, and then you still have to drive back. Did you do the same thing in reverse, or did you stop at different places?
I stopped at a lot of the same ones. There were different views because I was there at different times.
Okay.
I had a couple weird wildlife experiences on the way back. So I hadn't seen really any wildlife. Well, I had seen a porcupine on the way up. That was about it. And the Dempster's not super famous for wildlife. I have found that Yukon, there wasn't a lot of wildlife. I saw more wildlife in northern British Columbia than I did in Yukon. But on the way back, the first night, it was evening and I was driving. So keep in mind, it had rained overnight. It was like super wet. So I had waited to do my drive in the evening that day. And I came upon a fox that had this dead rabbit in its mouth. And he was just sitting there, and I'm taking pictures of him. And he just kept on sitting there. So I thought, okay, well, I guess I'm going to drive past him and kind of continue on my way. He was walking along the side of the road, and I pulled in front of him, just driving really slow, taking some pictures, and it came and started following my van. And I was like, this fox is following my van. So I basically stopped, and there's no cars for miles and miles and miles, so it doesn't matter that I've stopped in the middle of the road. The fox came running by me, trotting down the road, still on the side of the road, walking by me again. So I pulled in front of him again. And he followed me. He got behind my van again. And we did this like 3 times. I probably followed this fox for like a mile down the road. And it was either me following him or him following me. And then he got bored and just ran off into the bushes. So that was kind of weird. But the second thing was actually in Tombstone Territorial Park. And it was like 11:15 at night, and I had fallen asleep. And it's still a little light out, right? Because it never is completely dark. Mm-hmm. And I heard some like sprinkling noise on the top of my roof, like click, click, click. Usually when it's click, click, rain is starting, and that's waking me up because the metal roof, you hear everything that hits the fan. Well, then I heard some more, and it kind of sounded concentrated in one spot, and kind of 2 things flashed in my mind. One is somebody throwing gravel at my van? I'm always, I was parked there by myself in a gravel pit, and I always just have a little bit of fear when I'm van camping all alone, something's going to happen. It's just maybe a girl thing, and a paranoia thing. But then I also thought, well, it could also be a bird, but it sounds like a really big bird. So I peeked from behind my curtain, and I'm looking in my rear view mirrors trying to see something, and I see this flash of white. Now I'm like, is that like somebody's white T-shirt and somebody's outside of my van? And I'm kind of freaking out. I'm like, I got to figure out what's going on here. And the next thing I know, I see an owl sitting on the ground. I was like, oh, cool, an owl. I'm going to try to take a picture of it. So I go outside my van, and it like flew over the top of my head and landed up on this hill. And next thing I know, it starts flying over my head and like swooping down at my head. And then it goes behind the hill and it comes back. And now there's 2 owls and they're swooping my head. And then a third one joins them. So I have like 3 owls swooping my head, and I can see their faces. Like they're probably maybe only 5 feet away from me. And this happened multiple times. And I just like thought it was such a weird experience. Like I've only seen owls 2 other times in my life. So that was the last night of that trip. And I had come back into Dawson City, and I stopped in there's actually in Dawson City, there's a Northwest Territories Visitor Center in Dawson City, even though it's in Yukon. Mm-hmm. And their main purpose is for promoting people to go up the Dempster Highway and make it all the way to Northwest Territories and do things up there and spend money up there. So sure. I was telling her that story, and she gets this like awful look on her face. And she said, has somebody died? And I'm like, no, what are you talking about? And she says, owls are like harbingers of death, and somebody is going to die in 24 hours.
Oh my gosh.
And I sort of like had this freaky feeling. And I messaged my family. I'm like, is everybody okay? And everybody was okay. But that was a little, it put a little bit of fear in me because it was just such a weird experience.
So the one thing I wanted to key in on that story besides the owls is you were free camping then. You were not always camping in campgrounds.
I did pay for 2 nights up at Inuvik. Basically, Once you make your way all the way to Inuvik, there is no place to camp for free anymore up there. So There are, but they're kind of like on the edge of a junkyard or something like that. And Tuktoyaktuk really has stopped it. So actually, I want to touch back on Tuktoyaktuk. The other really cool thing a person needs to do up there is a park that is for the pingos.
And I did not know what these were until I was researching this show. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Pingo is basically, it's a permafrost thing, but it's basically a great big ice cube that is covered by earth. And it looks like this hill. And I think it's like the second largest in the world is there right at Tuktoyaktuk. And so that actually also is part of the Canada parks. You can see it for many miles because there's no hills out there. So that's like the big hill.
Well, and there's more than one. It's the Pingo National Landmark. Yes. In fact, it is a quarter of the world's pingos. This is a sentence that meant nothing to me until just a few minutes ago.
There is a place though that you can park, and if a person had a canoe, they could even canoe over there. There's actually I didn't get over there, but I know there's a wooden boardwalk.
Okay.
Take a canoe across this one bay out of the Arctic Ocean. So that's definitely, you will see it, but it's worth stopping and reading all about the pingos there.
We talked about the camping also in terms of vehicles. So you did not have a 4-wheel drive vehicle.
Nope.
You don't need one, but it might be nice is kind of what I'm hearing from what you're saying.
Not only do I not have a 4x4, so I have a Ford Transit Connect, and it's a pretty low clearance vehicle. And as I mentioned, there were a few times I probably was in about 4 inches of mud. The anti-slip brakes went off probably a couple dozen times on that trip.
Oh, geez. And you don't have a winch or anything, too, that you would tend to have in a 4x4.
Yeah, no. I just tried to drive carefully. Sure. Like I said, on the times when it was really wet, I just said, okay, I'm just not gonna. And when it's dry, it's a completely different experience. There are parts of that road when dry, it almost feels like you're driving on pavement. It's so, like the road is so good when it's dry. It was really just the wet road that was really the problem.
Well, and I still think it was funny that you somehow think people are going to judge you for being a fraidy cat or something because you're afraid that somebody is outside while you're free camping on a gravel road driving 500 miles. I wouldn't worry about that.
Yeah.
I don't think you come across as someone who is afraid of their own shadow. I think there are other people who would decide not to do this trip. So now, is this a trip that you do for the scenery, or is it a trip that you do so you can say that you've done this trip?
all of the above.
Okay.
Yeah, I felt pretty accomplished doing it. It was kind of funny because when I started it, there's a sign right at the entrance. So you turn off the Klondike onto the Dempster, and there's an interpretive area there. And I had stopped, and I had met this couple that were coming south. They did just finished it, and they had this little teardrop camper, and it was completely covered with mud. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna do this. And coming back. I got there. I was all by myself. I've done this whole trip solo, with the exception of there was some bridge construction going on. So I got out of my car. It was like maybe the middle of the afternoon, and I was just doing like a little dance, and one of the construction workers like looked at me and then just turned around. They didn't realize how important that was to me, and I felt a little lonely, but I didn't really find many other people doing it solo, but it felt pretty accomplished after it was all done, but it was a little anticlimactic getting back and finishing the whole thing.
So definitely something you want to bring lots of podcasts or a good playlist or whatever, because you're going to need something to keep you busy.
There's no radio up there. Yeah,
exactly.
You have radio just at the last kind of little towns, and that's it. So
excellent. Yeah. Any other things that we should talk about that you saw or did along this route before we get to some of our wrap-up questions?
Yeah, just try to talk to some people if you can. Actually, like doing that art class was really a good chance because there were like a couple girls that had lived there all their lives, and I was just asking them all the questions I could.
And what did you learn from the questions you asked them?
Just kind of asking them like what it's like growing up there and what their opportunities are when they're getting older, like what their favorite time of year to be up there, that sort of thing, and what their favorite festivals. So we're talking about all those things and foods. And
what was their favorite time and their favorite festival?
Some of them actually like the winter time.
I would hope if you live someplace like that, you'd like winter, but okay.
So the one festival that looks really fascinating to me is they celebrate the first light after the winter.
Okay.
So the first time the sun comes up after like a month of no sun, they have a festival for that.
I think I would celebrate that as well. Just shortly after having gone crazy, but I would definitely celebrate that if I made it through there.
Yeah.
Some wrap-up questions for you. You're standing at the prettiest spot on the whole Dempster Highway. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I think it would be Tombstone Territorial Park. So even if a person didn't want to go all the way up there, because I recognize it's 550 miles each way on gravel road, if a person were going from, say, Whitehorse to Dawson City on the Klondike, they should definitely do the detour and go up there to that park.
Okay. One thing that makes you laugh out loud and say only on the Dempster Highway.
I think those two wildlife experiences were pretty interesting.
And I'm glad that no one has died. And
nope.
If you had to summarize the whole drive in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
550 miles gravel.
All right. Excellent. Our guest again is Lisa from thehotflashpacker.com, and she refuses to say whether I'm supposed to say the hot flashpacker or the hot flashpacker. So we'll let you figure out what she means by that by going over to thehotflashpacker.com. And Lisa, you are in the process of writing the post that we're going to send people to, I understand.
Yes. Yep. So I should be publishing that in October. I don't have the URL ready yet, so just search in the search engine for Dempster.
But she should finish that before I get this out, so hopefully we'll be linking to that article in the show notes. So if you go to the show notes for this article, hopefully there'll be a link to Lisa's post on driving the Dempster Highway. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Canada and your love for road trips, clearly, and for the Dempster Highway.
Yeah, thanks.
In news of the community, I heard recently from Esmer, who said, Chris, I love your podcast and started listening to get more info on Spain before arriving, among every other informative episode I've listened to so far. I wasn't sure where to comment on the web, so I decided to email instead. Just quickly wanted to point out something that wasn't brought up on your Jamaica episode. I was surprised that there was no mention of the large percentage of Irish immigration and history in Jamaica, as it is also something I wanted to learn more about as far as culture. Thank you, Esmer. Esmer, that was news to me. I did not know there was a large Irish representation in Jamaica, so I was pleased to get your letter. In terms of where you can comment online, every episode of Amateur Traveler has a series of show notes. If you go to the top page of amateurtraveler.com and click on the Amateur Traveler logo, that will take you to all of the episodes sorted chronologically, or they're also sorted by destination. If you scroll a little further down on the top page, you can click on Europe, for instance, to get episodes on Europe, and then there's a list of countries that you can click on. And that is also true for every article we write on the site. And so that should make it a little easier for you to find things in the future. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com, or send me a letter, as Esmer did, to host@amateurtraveler.com. Don't forget mytravelcreditcard.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.